everybody. Welcome to today's Life Sciences Roundtable discussion on linguistic validation. My name is Mark Schreiner, and I, along with my colleague Ulrich Frick, will be moderating today's roundtable discussion on the topic of linguistic validation. Now, we've had an amazing turnout. I think we have close to 200 people who've registered for this event, and that shows that obviously there's a lot of interest in linguistic validation. We're going to do a deep dive on the subject, talk about what it is and why it's important. But before we do that, I want to just take a couple minutes. I'd like to thank all the people who registered for this event. I'd like to thank our amazing panelists, and I'd like to thank my colleagues at memoQ for organizing this event. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Karen Tkachik at Masterword for her support, because she introduced 3 of the panelists for today's discussion. So thank you, Karen, for that. Before we get started on the panel discussion, I do want to introduce our panelists, but it's going to be an abbreviated introduction because we have 6 different panelists. So if you want more about their background, you can go to the registration page or go to their LinkedIn profile. We have 3 highly qualified linguists. We have Sofia Correia, who's a medical translator and writer based in Portugal. We have Eva Stabenow, who is a medical translator and writer, I believe, based in Nashville. Kristin Kamm, who's a medical translator based in New York. We have Rafa Zaragoza, who's the Global Director Quality, Risk, and Compliance for TOPPAN Digital Language. I believe he's originally from Spain, but now lives in Virginia. Stephane Millet, who is the Director of Strategic Accounts, Clinical and Patient Engagement Solutions for the Acolad Group. Originally from France, I believe went to university in Germany, is now living in New York. And from memoQ, we have Richard Sikes, who is the Senior Consultant Business Services for memoQ. And Richard, when he is not off on some exotic ski slope in Austria or some other place, is probably in Toronto. And then we have my co-moderator, Ulrich Frick, who is the head of our Dutch Benelux region, and also, I just recently found out, manages our key accounts in Australia. And Ulrich, when he's not off on some scuba diving trip in some exotic location, is in Bonn, Germany. Since we have 6 panelists, we're going to try to guide the conversation in a way that everybody can participate. But in the first hour, we're going to give a bit of the priority to our 3 linguists, as we're going to kind of focus on each particular step in the linguistic validation process. In the second hour, we're going to get a little bit more into the business discussion, talk about the use of technology, recruiting best practices, training methods and requirements, quality metrics and systems, and then talk about integrations with different technology platforms, etc. Now, the last thing before we kick this off, I just kind of want to touch on why this topic is so important and relevant. You know, this is a time where many people are concerned about the commoditization of translation and even content creation. And there's a concern about the improvements and the increased utilization of technologies like machine translation and, of course, ChatGPT. So it's nice to discuss an area where the human touch and subject matter expertise are still highly valued. And that's the case with linguistic validation. In fact, the market for linguistic validation is expected to grow steadily, at least until the year 2030. You can see that we have a couple of quotes here on the slide that's being shared. The size of the global clinical trials market is expected to exceed $84.43 billion by 2030, which represents a 5.7% growth. So that growth is obviously going to drive demand for more linguistic validation. But in addition to that, you have things like decentralized trials. You have a greater drive towards inclusivity, where you have to have participants from a broader range or from more different countries and cultures. And that makes, it brings linguistic validation into play more. We have a quote from Slater there that says, linguistic validation is both growing faster and generally more profitable for LSPs than other parts of the market. And I don't know how many of you get excited about earnings calls and annual reports, but there's a few public companies in our industry. And on one of their recent earning calls and annual reports, the CEO and several of the other leaders of their executive team basically were just kept talking about the the promise and potential of linguistic validation and how they were making it one of their big bets for their company's future. So there's obviously a lot of demand there. There's it's a critically important service, but what we're going to do today is kind of dig into what it actually is, and you know, what are the things that the critical success factors. So with that said, I think we can turn that slide off and let's just jump into the discussion. So I want to start at a very high level, just to kind of level set, because with linguistic validation, it's a process, and the process can vary from time to from company to company, project to project, but it also has a goal or objective. So I'd like to ask all of our linguists and Rafa and Stephane, just to level set, what's your idea or opinion in terms of what's the goal of linguistic validation? We'll get into the process later, but what's the goal? And let's, Eva, can we start with you?
Hi, thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. What is the goal of linguistic validation? In a nutshell, it is to accurately transpose clinical scales, a kind of clinical trial instruments into another language and culture so that the results are comparable, I would say. And this is off the top of my head. I've not prepared this answer. No,
that's awesome. And it that's exactly what I've seen. It's comparable. Let's go over to Anna Sofia. How does it differ from just regular translation?
Well, how does it differ from regular medical translation, right? The thing is that medical translation tends to be highly technical and scientific, right? So, but with linguistic validation, it's not just about translating the words. So you have basically a list of concepts that you need to transpose to the target language, and sometimes that requires a completely different translation, right? That requires that means that the translation will not be 100% equivalent to the source text. So what matters is that we understand the concept that is being tested, the answer, what the item intends to assess, and then come up with an alternative in our target language that conveys the exact same meaning. And because the cultures are different, habits are different, so we have to find proper alternatives to that. So that's basically the complexity of linguistic validation and how it is different from, like you say, regular translation.
Excellent, thanks. Kristin, did you want to add anything to that?
I think my colleagues covered it pretty well. I would just add that the ultimate goal is that you're collecting data, right? So these are scales that are given to patients to get their responses, whether it's about a treatment or how their disease has changed or the severity, whatever it is, and you're trying to get reliable data. So the goal of linguistic validation, while it is to transfer these scales from one language to another, the end goal of that is to get usable data that is not skewed or affected by that language transfer. So we need to create translations that are neutral, for lack of a better word, that aren't influenced. For example, many of these scales are written in English. If they're going into German, if they're going into Portuguese, whatever, that they're not overly influenced by what the English wording is, but that they are appropriate for the market in which they are being used, so that the data that comes from the scales is reliable, accurate, and unbiased.
One of the words that I've heard often used is equivalency. So linguistic equivalency. Can any of our panelists give an example of when a word for word might not be appropriate, but equivalency would be a better objective?
If you're translating a scale that is written in English and adapting it into Portuguese, but yes, a question asked, is it how difficult it is for you to shovel snow, for example? And if you, here in Portugal, we only have snow with not that often, and in specific regions of Portugal. So somewhere here in Coimbra, that the person wouldn't know how to answer that question. So we have to find an equivalent based on a list of concepts that the author provides us, and we have to come up with a proper alternative. For example, is it acceptable to carry heavy grocery shops instead of shoveling snow, for example? That's one of the examples I used to illustrate exactly that it's not a translation, but an equivalence of concepts.
Thank you.
I would also add that because I work as the back translator, so we often get this instruction to translate literally, which is a little misleading, because the example that I always use is it's raining cats and dogs. The way that means it's pouring in English, right? But the way that you say that, for example, in French is very different. As a back translator, if I see the correct expression, the correct idiomatic expression that properly conveys it's raining cats and dogs into French, as a back translator, despite getting this instruction to translate literally, I actually think it's incorrect to back translate that phrase word for word from French into English, because it means nothing in English when it's then transposed back into English word for word based on the French. But if the French expression is correct, then I'm going to back translate that as raining cats and dogs, because the concept is equivalent.
Gotcha. Kristin, we had a conversation before, and I really liked your comment that sometimes translators take the instruction to translate literally to literally. I thought that was awesome.
Yeah.
Let's go on to the next one. I'm going to ask one more high-level question, and then we're going to get into the very specific steps of linguistic validation. And let's open this one up to Rafa and Stephane. From your perspective, what's the biggest challenge or critical success factor for ensuring a good job when you're doing linguistic validation? Stephane, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Well, one of the challenges is to avoid ambiguities. Kristin mentioned it, the importance to yield data in order to pull statistical information about the outcome, and in order to do that, we need to find the right terms and translate the instruments so that they are functionally equivalent from any language, so from the English all the way to other languages. So in order to do that, we need to avoid any type of ambiguities. You mentioned some examples before. I have another one where once we had to translate a question, and it was, are you feeling a bad effect right now? And just the word bad effect could have been interpreted in so many different ways, and would have been translated in many different ways, yielding different data and different information from the different translators and versions that we translated. So I think that one of the challenges is to make sure that there is absolutely no ambiguity between in the understanding of the questionnaires. And in order to do that, we really pay a lot of attention to what I call concept definition, and work very closely with the sponsors and the authors of the questionnaires to make sure that we have a clear understanding of every single term, every single answers of the instrument, so that we can write down guidelines, instructions, intentions of all of the questions, and communicate that very clearly to the translators and the back translators, so that there is absolutely consensus on the meaning of the different questions in all the instruments.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Richard, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I think it would be important at this juncture, because there may be some people here who are not familiar with linguistic validation terminology. The word instrument has come up in some of the commentary from my panelists colleagues. I think we ought to define that word for those people who may not know what it means in this context. An instrument is not some kind of a device. It's not like a, I don't know, a compass or a stethoscope or something like that. An instrument is a, please chip in, my colleagues, if you disagree with my interpretation here. An instrument can be a set of instructions or a linguistic entity of some kind that goes through this process. It could be questions that evoke responses, right? So it's not something physical.
Thanks for that, Richard. Anna Sofia.
Yeah, just to because it's a relevant question that Richard raised. So when we say instrument, it's the general term to refer to everything that has to go through a linguistic validation process. So it can be a patient questionnaire, can be a visual scale, can be any kind of tool that is used to assess the patient report, the outcomes that patients report. So it's the general term to define that.
Thank you. And you both bring up a really good point that there's a lot of specialized terminology in this space. And some of the acronyms actually share, I mean, some of the terms actually share similar acronyms and stuff like that. So apologies to the audience if we sometimes use terms that we haven't predefined. I'll try to kind of get out in front on that. Rafa, we haven't heard from you yet. From where you sit, because we all kind of sit in unique areas of linguistic validation. So from where you sit, what is the biggest challenge to ensuring that you're doing an appropriate job for your customers?
So well, first of all, thank you for having me. This is really an honor to be sharing with such a knowledgeable panel. But I'll say, from my point of view, at the end of the day, since I sit on the quality bit, which is all related to the processes, is more related to, okay, what is the point? Where is the goal of linguistic validation? Then at the end of the day, yes, what we're talking about equivalent is conceptually equivalent. That is what Anna was mentioning earlier. At the end of the day, what we want to make sure is that everything that we're doing, all these steps that we are taking into consideration, is so that we can present all of this to the health authorities to make sure that basically all these differences, all these questions, all the data that has been gathered is reliable and it's comparable, so that it can be exported in a way. So I think, like, from my point of view, what I take care of on the quality side is more on the risk management and risk assessment of the processes that we're following, of the vendor recruitment that we're doing, of the different training that we have for our linguists to be able to conduct all of these projects.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is, I mean, there's linguistic elements, there's process elements, and then there is the vendor management, the recruitment, the training process as well. And as I mentioned, we're going to come back to the recruitment and training processes on the second part of this conversation. But it kind of sets the stage that it's not just about the quality of the translation. It's a whole process. So let's dig into that now. And I think the next few questions will be primarily targeted towards our three medical translators. So let's, in terms of the workflow, let's forward translations. Anna Sofia, what's the critical element with a forward translation? One, two, multiple, what should be the target of the translator?
Well, in my opinion, the number of forward translations, I think for me, from the consultant who does the reconciliation, the ideal is 2. I think that more than 2 forward translations, like I had in the past, is too much. I think that 2, provided that, and the ideal process for me is an ongoing discussion between the translations, not just okay, you do the forward translation, another one does another forward translation, and then the consultant does the reconciliation. I think ideally the forward translation should be done by 2 different people and reconciled by a third one, but if possible, with a meeting between the 3 people, the three linguists, just to make sure that everything is correctly and conceptually correct.
Eva and Kristin, what instructions would you give or advice would you give to a forward translator? Either one of you can just jump in. I mean, what should they be thinking about as their objective?
I think we're both hesitating because both of us don't usually do the forward translation. I'm usually the end stage reviewer. I look at the clinician review. I do the final editing, proofreading, integrating, all of that. And I know that Kristin mostly does the back translation. So I'm not usually involved in the forward translation. Having said that, from the forward translations I've seen, I'm not always sure that forward translators are appropriately briefed on the concepts. I don't think there is necessarily always that that meeting that Anna Sofia had mentioned. So I think it would be helpful for forward translators to be trained and to have all that information at their hands so they can produce as good a functional equivalent, I'm going to call it, of the source text for the purpose that is intended to serve, so that the person reconciling it can produce a product that's as good as possible. And so that basically to set the stage for quality at the end. It's the first step. And I always like to think of things in terms of architecture. You can't really build a good house without a good foundation. So I feel like the forward translations are the foundation. So we need to really make sure that's appropriately done in an appropriately informed way by people who are very capable and very well informed and trained in that respect. Does that make sense?
One of the, okay, got a couple hands there, but let me just ask real quick, and getting in probably in front of your hands. What about the readability of the target audience? I mean, is that something, Kristin, did you want to add, or did?
Well, what I was going to add to your original question is that the people working on these projects need to remember that these are patient-facing documents, instruments, however you want to call them, especially if they're questionnaires. They are patient-facing. And so just as with an informed consent form, which doesn't go through a linguistic validation process, but is also a patient-facing document, there is a need to use the correct register, right? Like there are guidelines for writing these types of documents so that they are accessible to people of various educational backgrounds, various reading levels, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really important to use, I would say, like the simpler terms, right? So we don't necessarily say, I'm going to take an example from an informed consent form, which again doesn't go through linguistic validation, but it's not wrong to say study physician, right? But study doctor is the more accessible term because doctor is a lower register term than physician, right? So we need to, in linguistic validation, always keep in mind what the end goal is and the end user, and the fact that these need to be really understandable text at the end of the day.
Excellent. So
Can
what
I
I'm
just-
hearing is, I'm letting you go, but what I'm hearing is,
Mhm.
before you even start translating, you got to understand who the target audience is and what is your readability goal. Okay. So I got 4 hands up, and I think Anna Sofia, you were first, and then Rafa.
Yeah. So I just want to add to what Eva said about the translators being properly debriefed, and I know that is not happening as it should be happening with forward translation, and we often and also about what Kristin said is that when the translator gets the questionnaire to be translated, what I get often is, on one hand, the translation is too literal, so and doesn't take into account the equivalence and the need for adaptation. And in the opposite extreme, I get a translation that the translator read the text, knows that it doesn't adapt to their reality, and adapts too much and takes on a transcreation tone without taking into consideration what is the item assessing. And that's mostly because they don't receive that initial debriefing about the purpose of the questionnaire. And in my experience, for example, the translators doing the forward translation don't receive the list of concepts, that translatability assessment that is done prior to the forward translation step. The person who gets the list of concepts is the person doing the reconciliation, the language consultant, then has to take the 2 forward translations and get and elaborate a consensus version. But when we have these 2 forward translations that are useless, so to speak, because they don't have access to that debriefing, so I think it may defeat the purpose of the whole forward translation plus reconciliation process. So it's important that translators receive that debriefing, and that debriefing includes information about the target audience. And I know that we are going to talk about all the steps. Don't forget that the better we start, the less the lower number of changes we have to make once we get to the cognitive debriefing, the testing with the patient step. So it's good to start in a good position right from the start.
Yeah, you can say measure once or measure twice, cut once, or an ounce of prevention, pound of cure, all that. That's awesome advice. Thank you. Rafa, I believe you're next.
Thank you. So I completely agree with Anna Sofia here, and also in line with what Kristin was mentioning. I just wanted to add, because like we keep talking about quality, but then something that is important that we also talk about is, what is quality? What do we understand by quality? Because sometimes it's very clear to us what we understand by quality, and I feel like that is a very subjective definition, because a client can have a completely different definition of quality depending on what their priorities are. It might be on-time delivery, it might be a specific terminology, it might be specific concepts. There are so many different scenarios in which we might get negative feedback from the client, even if there's nothing linguistically wrong, that would still not be considered as quality. So I think like that is also something that, because each client is its own world, the definition of quality is also something that is very case by case specific. And when we talk about quality right now, yes, it's more quality, but it's like, okay, what do we understand by it, on which direction? There's not such a thing as overall global definition of quality.
Yeah, and we could probably have a whole nother webinar just on that topic of quality, and we could go on for several hours, because it is it's very case by case, somewhat subjective. I think what I've seen over and over is readability by the target audience, and it has to achieve a certain kind of readability. And I'll come back to that in a second. Just quickly, a couple more add-ons, and then we have to move on. Stephane, and then Eva, please.
Well, I just wanted to go back to your initial questions about the steps. I agree with the two forward translation, and in fact, there is we follow a guideline, which is the ISPO guideline, which is a well-established process for linguistic validation, and it calls for the two forward translation and then reconciliation. And then I want to add to the patient audience to be able to well understand their social cultural background, where they are, where they're located. But also, we found also that during cognitive debriefing, for example, the importance of knowing what's the therapeutic area we're working in, what's their condition, and you talked about readability, where sometimes some patients are impaired and have difficulty just reading. So we need to understand, we need to know what's their condition and what's the disease that we're trying to research in order to really find the right terms, the right tone, the right readability level. So that's what I think is important. Now, you asked me before about the challenges that we were facing, and being able to provide the concept definitions to the translators. I completely agree that it should be done at the very beginning, to the forward translators and to the ones who harmonize it, to entire team, in fact. But it's sometimes challenging because it's, there have been, I thought a long time ago, many questions, many instruments or many questionnaires have been developed by individuals and institutions, and it's not always easy to get access to the initial, so to the author, and really understand what was the initial intent with a specific question. So that's why it's important to really clearly speak with the sponsors, with the study team, to understand what we are analyzing here, what data we're trying to yield, in order to find the right terminology and the right terms. So there's a lot here we could talk about. And Rafa, you touched on the quality topic, which, like you said, Mark, that's a whole other webinar that we could have on that topic.
Thank you. Excellent. So I'm hearing it over and over again. The more preparation, the better. The more information, the better. The last one on this question, and then let's move on. Eva?
Thanks. I just had a few little add-ons to that. So I completely agree with what Kristin said about the readability for the patient-facing part of things. I happen to work on quite a few diagnostic scales. Parts of those are directed towards the physicians administering the scale, and it is important to keep that in mind, that there may be two different audiences. And for that, I have noticed that it is helpful to me to have the actual document. So not just in either an Excel spreadsheet or in memoQ, for instance, where you just have the text juxtaposed, but the actual layout where it tells you what is addressed to whom, so you can actually make sure that those align with the person you are speaking to. And I've seen some of the translations not take that into account, and I have a feeling, knowing my translation colleagues, I kind of know what a good translation looks like, and what a good translator would do if they were aware of this. I can see if the translation is good and it's not taking this into account, that they probably haven't been shown this, so they don't have that information. So I think that's crucial. And the other thing is that these scales, at least the ones I work on, are often ones that the diagnostic scales that have been developed a long time ago, as Stephane touched on. And so they are not necessarily written with translation in mind, or transculturalization, I'm going to call it, internationalization. So that needs to be taken into account. And it can sometimes, another aspect, I don't want to get too deeply into things, is that if you have these existing scales, you will have existing partial translations that then also have to be taken into account for these instruments. So it gets pretty complicated. And just circling back to what I think Anna had really touched upon very well, and Rafa had touched upon, that is really important that everyone involved at every step have the training, have the background knowledge, and have all the information that they need to do a good job.
Awesome. First off, thank you for mentioning memoQ. And you actually touched on a question I was going to ask later about, some of the different documents, PROs versus CROs, because you have a different audience, and how do you want to translate that? Come back to that later. And as I mentioned, we kind of have to move on because we kind of stuck on this first question, and we got so many more to get to. Let me ask something that maybe it could be just a yes or no on. There has been a movement towards, for one of the forward translations, some companies trying to use MT or machine translation for one of those translations. Quick, just yes, no, and an abbreviated why it is or why it shouldn't be. Who wants to go first?
I can go first with a no. I think that okay, just yes or no, sorry. But the thing is like I mentioned before, that too literal or too transcriptive translation will defeat the purpose. A machine translation will definitely defeat the purpose. So we're talking about providing translators with the debriefing, the concept elaboration. We emphasize that it's not about translating words and meaning, just words and meanings, but concepts to be measured. But then you run any kind of tool for through machine translation, and it will translate it literally. So basically, I think it's a hard no for me. I try to be brief.
Any agreements or disagreements there? Eva, you have your hand up, and then next Rafa.
Sorry, I just forgot to take it down.
And Kristin.
I will lower my hand, but
Okay.
Obviously it's a no on my end too. And I'll try and make it short and not rant. You are trying. Translation
Translators
is not
ranting against MT.
That would be a novel concept, right? Basically, but translation is not math. We all know that. It's not a one-to-one equivalent. And when you have, legal documents where it's standard language, that's one thing. I'm just saying this, I don't work in legal. But what we're trying to do with this specifically is we're trying to get specific answers to get specific reliable data. And that is a thought process that needs to be handled by someone who's actually thinking about it, and not by just transposing something that exists. And having seen some of these legacy scales, they're also just not worded very clearly. So the result is going to be even less likely to elicit the results that we actually want.
Thank you. 2 strikes against MT for forward translations. Rafa and then Stephane, and then we'll move on to the next question.
So on my side, I would definitely, I'm going to go with Anna and Eva as well. Like, I would say no. I'm not saying no, like it will never be the case. I think that as we are moving forward with machine translation and the more NMT that we find, potentially in the future, and maybe not so far away future, we will be able to use it as one of the 2 front translations. I think as it is right now, and going back to the risk management and the importance of what the linguistic validation is, that could actually be considered like a pretty high risk. If something doesn't go well, it's translated to literal and then is not spotted during the quality control steps, then the risk of wasting the amount of money and data after it has been completed, it is enormous. So in terms of like risk, I don't think it's worth it, at least not with how it is right now.
Thank you for that. So 3 strikes and it should be out, but Stephane, what's your thoughts?
Well, my thought is that it's actually, I'm often asked, can we do machine translation on these instruments? And I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it will make any sense, because a lot of times, why are they asking us to do MT is to gain time and reduce the cost. But the reality is that all these steps that we described, the concept definitions, the 2 forward translations, it will, even if we were to use MT, and maybe in some instances we would be able to do it, it calls for post editing. So a human, so translators who post edit the output, the raw output, and it wouldn't add value into the process. So I don't think it's even relevant at this point. I don't think the technology is there yet for us to be able to say to our clients, yes, you were going to be faster able to deliver and validate these instruments, and it's going to cost less because all the steps we described will still be necessary, whether or not we use the technology to help us.
Kristin?
I would just say that these instruments that go through this process are localized down to very specific markets.
Mhm.
So, you know, how many variants of Spanish are there, right? Like every country has its own little flavor of Spanish, and its cultural sensibilities come into play in this process. And a computer just doesn't know that, right? Like, I don't think we're at any point where the machine knows the difference between the cultural equivalents in Argentina versus Chile. And so I am also a no. I mean, I don't work on forward translation. Again, I'm a back translator in this process, but yeah, there's so much emphasis on cultural equivalence in these instruments that go through this process, that to assume that a computer can do that is just a little far-fetched. Again, at this point, who knows where we'll
Okay, I think it's unanimous, and I think you all make awesome points. Anna Sofia, I see you have your hand up, but I'm going to ask you a question so you can give your comments on this and then start the next question. And the next question is, when it comes to the consolidation, I can't imagine, I mean, you know, you've got these two forward translations, and then you have to start picking and mixing and matching. And so how does that, what are some, I mean, you can weigh in on that MT question if you want, but also please follow up with best practices for that consolidation piece.
Okay, thank you. I just want to add one final thing about the use of machine translation. So you wouldn't use a machine to create a questionnaire, right? You wouldn't just ask a machine to write a questionnaire. You consult with experts, and then you test the original version with patients. That's how the validation of a questionnaire goes from the creation part, the development part. So why would you use it in the linguistic validation process when it's just as a creative process as in the development of the tool itself? So just
makes sense.
A final note about the reconciliation. Well, it usually you have to combine both versions. Sometimes you see that both versions are not exactly correct, so you have to come up with your own. But that's because, like I said before, forward translators usually are not provided with a proper debriefing and a proper list of concepts. So we compare both translations, and then based on the list of concepts that we are available, we build the consensus version based on those two forward translations.
Do you ever combine the two? Like I'm talking about for a single question, where you take elements of one, or do you have to, is it either or? It's either this one or this one?
Yeah, no, ideally you combine. Of course, there will be translations that will be there in one item and another is there. We don't choose the best of the translation, but we incorporate the best aspects of each forward translation into a final version.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, I can't believe how fast time's going here. So Richard has a question, and then Ulrich, I think you've had some questions from the audience. So we'll go to Richard, and then we're going to go to the audience, and then pretty soon we're going to take a break. I can't believe it's just boom. Richard.
Yeah, just real quick here. An important part of the combination effort, or the putting together the two forward translations, is also the audit trail. And so it's important. One thing that I know, we're going to talk about the TMS aspects later, but one part that we pay particular attention to is having a cumulative audit, so that if a translator or a combiner, or I don't know what you call it, editor, makes a choice to choose one or the other, or to combine them in some way, as was just described, there's also a comment field where that choice is justified by the person who makes the choice. It's important.
Makes a lot of sense. So you can track it, but also people can understand the rationale behind it.
That's right. There's an audit trail.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so like I said, I've got so many more questions, and we're just not going to get to them all, but that's okay. Let's Ulrich, do you want to take over for now and we'll get to the questions that were asked from the audience, and after we get through those, we'll take a break.
Yes, there are 3 questions, so I just read them out loud and please take an answer. If a previously linguistically validated and copyrighted document needs to be amended in future, in spite of obvious flaws, we are supposed to make corrections only on the amended part, but cannot make any changes in the remaining content, and there lies the problem. What is the solution?
So the stories I could tell about this. We have I think that the main problem with using that tools that are already validated, and we see that a lot now since most tools are being integrated into mobile devices, right? So to electronic diaries and for patients to complete at home. So unfortunately, there's no solution because we cannot touch the text that has been previously validated. In most cases, we can alert the sponsor, we can alert the client that is asking us to do the linguistic validation to these issues, but we are unable to correct. So often we get a questionnaire that is not up to date, that is using, I once was asked to amend the question that was still asking about using diskettes in PC, so I had to keep that item, so you have an idea, and that was 5 years ago. So there are a lot of issues, and then with inclusive language, we can't even, in most cases, for gender, that language that have that differentiate genders, we can't even make sure that it uses a gender inclusive language, for example. So if it has been copyrighted and previously validated, and if the original author cannot be reached to ask for that kind of permission, we cannot change it, and we have to keep it and update it based on the legacy, another technical term, the existing version. So
excellent. Rafa, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Ana Sofia. I would just want to add that while we are not able to change it, I would say definitely if we see that there is something specifically wrong, objectively wrong, we definitely need to flag it to the client, to the project manager, if you're working with an LSP, something that is like not, if you see that something is objectively wrong or that is actually against the instructions you were given or any specific terminology might be related to maybe the migration, anything of that, even if you're not able to do the actual change, leaving a comment, flagging it, it's something that you can still do because that might be another conversation that can happen parallelly on maybe eventually it will get changed, but it might be something that it was not in scope or they weren't even aware of it.
Excellent. Last one on this, and then we'll just get one more question. Eva?
Thanks. Just a quick note. I agree with everything that's been said. I've seen this quite a lot. One thing that you really need to be aware of is for this flagging things, the audit trail that Richard mentioned, you definitely want to leave lots of comments and explain why you're making certain choices and flagging certain things. And you really, for this specific aspect, have to differentiate very clearly between actual errors and preferences. When there is a hard error, or something that is really culturally completely unacceptable, then I will make a much harder push to see if the sponsor, if the client can find a way to work around this or amend in some way, versus if there's something that I just don't like very much, then I'll just flag it and tell them, well, I would prefer this, but this is, I'm aware of the of what we have and what we have to work with. So I think that old standing thing in editing, preferential edits versus absolutely necessary and crucial edits, is something we really have to draw a hard line between for this particular aspect. I don't have a solution for how to handle it, but I think that that's an important aspect to consider.
Excellent. And thank you for bringing up the audit feature that's available on the TMS, memoQ TMS. But anyway, last question. Ulrich, let's do one more question before we go to the break.
Okay, this one will be a short one. Can you suggest any available specific training courses about linguistic validation?
How about, because that's actually a question I was going to ask later. And Rafa, actually, several of you brought up in previous discussions the importance of training. So what's your advice then for aspiring linguists who want to move into linguistic validation, or project managers? I mean, all of you have mentioned the importance of training. How can people skill up and learn these different roles? Eva,
so
you still have
on my
go ahead, Rafa.
No, I was gonna say, like, on my side, I would say, unfortunately, I don't know any resources that are available out there generally for linguists. I would even say, I mean, I studied translation studies at university, and I didn't even know what linguistic validation was when I left. So definitely, I think that there is an opportunity there in terms of the formal education, but beyond that, the way that at least at TOPPAN we do it, and I know all the LSPs as well, is basically we create our own training materials, instructions, guidelines, like everything that, so that we can actually work with the linguists, that if they have the medical background, they have the subject matter knowledge, then it's a matter of, okay, what is each step? What does it mean? What do we need to do? And do more of a coaching program with them and with our internal linguists so that we can get there.
That's good to know. So, I mean, you're willing to work with linguists. If they have that basic foundational ability, you'll help bring them along. Let's go to Kristin first, and then Anna and Sofia, and then we'll go to break.
I would just say that if you are able to work in-house at a company that does this, that's probably one of the best ways to learn. I was fortunate enough to have an in-house translation position at an LSP, which is kind of like a needle in a haystack type of job. I worked for the company for about six or 7 years, but I worked as an in-house translator for about 4.5 of those years. And that company had a linguistic validation division. So I learned by doing, and they had their own, again, internal training program. Yeah, so I was supported by the company, and then going out on my own and freelancing, I brought that knowledge with me. So for younger translators, perhaps, who are entering, if you can get a position either as a project manager for an LV division, if you can find an in-house translation position, which kind of doesn't exist really anymore, then that's the best way. I personally don't know of any specific courses. I know that at like ATA conferences and things like that, there are often sessions about it, but if that's, you know, very overviewy type information that gets communicated there usually.
Yeah, I'm just listening to you. I'm thinking what a huge opportunity for established linguists to possibly go and pitch a course to Middlebury or some of these other established schools as a adjunct professor to develop a program, or some LSPs or other organizations, because obviously there's a need there. Last one, Anna Sofia, and then we're going to go to break.
Yeah. So about the training, I can tell you that in I started working with LSPs that specialized in life science that also offered the linguistic validation, and LSPs when they are onboarding freelancers to work on this type of projects, ideally offered this kind of training. I went through extensive training with one of them about each step, forward translation, back translation, even cognitive debriefing that require particular skills to interview patients. So I started with forward translation and then moved up the process based on the project, the training I was receiving. But there are other resources. There are not resources specifically dedicated to the translation part, but there are two associations that provide some kind of training on the linguistic validation and patient-reported outcomes, quality of life tools, and that those are Acolad, and I can write it in the chat. I don't know if I have access to the chat, and ISPOR. So in these two associations, people can find, particularly Acolad has a translation special unit dedicated to translation and linguistic validation. So they often share resources and have courses on some aspects and some steps of the linguistic validation processes. That is one of the alternatives. But like we've been saying this panel and in previous conversation, there is an urgent need for more training for all the steps in linguistic validation.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's some good advice. And if we can't get it in the chat, what we'll do is we'll put it in the recording notes. Okay. So thanks. Hey, I have 2 minutes before the hour. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 10-minute break as planned. We will meet back and start up again at 8 minutes after the hour. Okay. And we've got a lot more questions to get through. So thank you so much so far, and be back in 10 minutes.